Good morning, everyone. Today's poem we're going to look at is Remains by Simon Armitage. Simon Armitage is one of the UK's favourite poets and is currently the Poet Laureate, having just taken over from Carol Ann Duffy. His style is often quite direct. He likes to tell stories of the everyday, of feelings that are easily relatable. When he does the tours with the Poetry Live with AQA, he's often one of the best received speakers, generally being amusing, easily relatable, very popular. And this poem, every time I've taught it, tends to be one of the poems that students remembers. Before we actually look at the poem, I cannot recommend highly enough to look, for those who are in my classes, on the O Drive, have a look at the video of Guardsman Tromans reading this poem and telling his story. It's probably available on the internet, I would imagine. It's the story of the soldier who has had to interrupt some looting of a bank robbery whilst on duty overseas, and effectively he's caught between two minds. He's caught between whether the gunman may be armed or may not be armed, and today's central quote certainly highlights that. And this is his first ending of a life, and the tone is full of grief and regret, and it lends itself to an enormous number of different themes within the poetry unit because it's so relatable to so many different types of conflict. I'll read it through, then we'll have a look at the first couple of stanzas in this part of the video before looking at the rest of the poem later on. Remains. On another occasion, we get sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind, so all three of us open fire, three of a kind, all letting fly, and I swear I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out, pain itself, the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body. Then he's carted off in the back of the lorry. End of story, except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on the patrol I walk right over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave. But I blink and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed, possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in desert sand, but near to the knuckle, here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands. Okay, so this is the issue I've got with the AQA anthology, by the way, that you have to keep turning the page rather than having all the notes on one side. So if you're working on the anthology, don't forget that the second part of the poem is on the back. I suggest you print it out as one and put it in an exercise book to annotate, so you can see all of the poem together, because you've got to look at all poems as a whole, haven't you, in terms of the structure. So let's start at the beginning with Remains. On another occasion. Let's have a look at this. We start on another occasion. We get the sense that this is a poem that starts in the middle of a longer conversation. Armitage did actually go and interview an awful lot of soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, and to talk about their experiences, and wanted to capture the reality of the effects of war, the trauma of what soldiers' stories brought back to the UK. And you can certainly see this within this poem. So on another occasion, we start right in the middle of a story, as if this has happened again and again and again. And it starts with a conversational tone. So we get the sense that this is directly from a soldier's story. This is in his language, and a lot of the colloquial language that repeats throughout the poem gives that sense that this is a soldier's story, but also a sense of a strange normality to the fact that killing goes on. These are normal people. These are ordinary guys and girls who go out and do this job to protect the UK, to protect our interests overseas, to protect other people's interests. And it's a job. And again, you might be thinking, if you've already watched the video on war photographer, or if you've already studied war photographer, that sense of doing a job in amongst conflict, these extraordinary lives that are being lived day to day in our world, make those two poems really, really useful to link. Remains and War Photographer go very, very well together, and we'll highlight that a little bit more later on as well. On another occasion, as well as the conversational tone, there is a cyclical sense with this poem. The idea that war never stops, that conflict never stops, that it just happens again and again and again on another occasion. That adverbial phrase that opens the poem, the sense that this is repeated often within the soldier's everyday existence overseas. And that in itself is quite sad as a tone to open with, that actually war doesn't end, conflict doesn't end. And again, when we look at the end of the poem and we start to look at the narrator's feelings at the end of the poem, even when he's back in the UK, back supposedly getting on with his life, he cannot forget what he's done, what's happened overseas, and that affects him greatly. So the sense that even if war stops for one individual person, those feelings don't stop. Those emotions are with him for life. On another occasion, we get sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank. So it's an everyday occurrence, and it might seem strange to us, the idea of looting being an everyday occurrence, but I guess that's the experiences of working in the armed forces overseas. And one of them legs it up the road. Legs it is one of those colloquial terms that comes through, the sense that this is the poem that belongs to the soldier. This is in his words, his emotions. So again, if you're looking at themes and you get a question perhaps that looks at individual responses to conflict, emotions connected with conflict, this is a great poem to look at, because we get the sense that it's from the soldier's perspective. One of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. It's a really heart-wrenching image, isn't it? Probably armed, possibly not. If we just take it as at face value and we think about what these soldiers are in the position to do, you've got somebody running away, possibly having robbed a bank, and it's your duty to protect that bank, to protect those interests. You can't wait, can you? You can't wait to give it a chance to see whether this person is armed or not, because if they are armed, yours and your colleagues' lives are in danger. So all three of a kind, as we get later on, all fire at him. But actually, do we know whether he's armed? And they never did know whether this man was armed, or certainly in the poem we never know whether this man was armed. So probably armed, possibly not. And again, we're always looking for in poems those images, those metaphors, those phrases where we can dig really deep with them and say a lot about a little. As I always tell my classes, a really good quote is like having a wet sponge, a really, really soaked sponge, and you can squeeze out as much as you possibly can from that quote, and writing, you know, half a page to 3/4 of a page on one quote shows the examiner that you're really thinking deeply about the images. And actually, from a practical point of view in the exam, where you've not got that poem in front of you, if you can get a lot out of one image, it means that you're writing in a more developed, in a more detailed way. So this is one of those images, probably armed, possibly not. First of all, we'll look at the repetition. Notice that it doesn't just come in the 4th line, but it comes over the page in one of the later stanzas, probably armed, possibly not. And it's in its repeated form later on in the poem. It's the sense that this is the image that flashes through his mind all the time, and it gives us this tone, it anchors the tone of the poem. It makes it very clear that this is a regretful poem. This is a soldier not who glorifies in anyone else's life, but someone who regrets it, feels guilt for it every second of his life. It never goes away from him that he's ended this man's life, and this is the crucial image about it. First of all, as I say, we've got the tone, we've got the fact that it's repeated. It's a dilemma. A dilemma is a situation in life where you're uncertain what to do. Do I do A? Do I do B? In this case, do I end a man's life or do I let him live? Most of us, thankfully, will never be in that particular position, but it's the ultimate dilemma, isn't it? And it haunts him. And it's central to the stress that he causes himself later on. This incident has left him with post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, another link perhaps to war photographer. And what else we've got here in terms of the language of this, we've got the degrees of certainty, and that's the juxtaposition of the two adverbs probably and possibly. If something is probably, if it's probable, it's more likely. So generally, it was more likely that this man was armed, but there is that level of doubt, that adverb possibly, maybe he wasn't, and that's the part that will always haunt this soldier. Maybe he's ended someone's life unessentially. He didn't need to do it, and that must be heartbreaking. And if you look at the video that I recommended earlier on, you can really see the heartbreak in Guardsman Troman's voice, in his actions, in the way he delivers this particular story. So that's a central image to the poem, one of those quotes that you'll definitely want to learn if this was a poem you decided to use as your unseen poem in your comparison. In the second stanza then, well, myself and somebody else and somebody else. Notice there the lack of specific detail. We're not given names, we're not given ranks, we're given somebody else and somebody else. Why do we have that? Well, in my opinion, it's the fact that who he was with is not crucial to his story. It's not what he remembers. He doesn't remember sharing that guilt. This is individual guilt. So the other two people who have equally ended this man's life are not central to him. He doesn't share the guilt. He takes it all on himself. He feels the whole regret of the three of their actions alone. Are all of the same mind. And again, all three of them are acting the same way. These are trained soldiers. These are professionals who go out to do a job. And although they've done their job and they've done what was expected of them, there's still that level of guilt that he takes on, even though they all acted in the same way. So all three of us open fire. Three of a kind, all letting fly. Three of a kind is interesting as an image. On the base level, three of a kind, well, there are three individuals and we're all in the same boat, we're all doing the same thing. It could be a deliberately chosen phrase, three of a kind, because three of a kind is a hand in poker. And if you think about card games as a sense of luck, a sense of fortune, and it's not a huge leap to start thinking about fortune as fate. And actually there's a lot in this poem that is fatalistic, where he believes that he's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And maybe this is the first hint that he believes that fate has led him to end someone's life, and he regrets how fate has brought him in this way. In that sense, the idea of fatalistic, and we'll mention it again, particularly with the final image in the poem in part 3, but that idea of being fatalistic really links to the second stanza of Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes in What Cold Clockwork of the Stars, that rhetorical question in the middle of that second stanza, where the soldier pauses for a minute. So if you were wanted to make those links with Bayonet Charge, that particular image might be something that you could build upon there. Okay, we'll move on to the next few stanzas in the next part.